Okay, so we're going to wrap this section up talking about what happens in the long run. So as we've seen in the short run, firms can earn profits or they can earn losses. Sometimes they choose to shut down if they cannot cover their variable costs, or in other words, if price is below average variable cost. So in the short run, profits or losses can occur. And what happens over the long run is that these profits and losses act as a motivation for either new firms to enter the market if there are profits being made, or if there are losses being made, then that encourages firms to exit and get out because nobody wants to lose money. And so profits and losses are acting as signals, kind of like a traffic light, right? So green, right? Profits telling new firms to enter, to go into this industry. Red, losses, right? Telling firms, stop producing, get out. You're losing money, right? So this is the way that we can think of signals telling people and firms what to do, what course of action to take, just like a stoplight tells us whether we need to stop, slow down, or go. So it's just a way of conveying to decision makers the information needed to make good decisions. So an effective signal doesn't just convey information, but it also provides an incentive to react properly, just like a stoplight pretty much gives you an incentive to react properly, because you know that if there's a red light up ahead of you, you don't want to just plow through it because there is a good chance you would get into a car accident and maybe get hurt, right? All right, so let's talk about exit and entry of firms. So again, economic profits are signaling to firms that they should enter the market and they should bring new resources into that market and to chase those profits. Whereas economic losses are basically signaling that there are too many resources being put into this industry. There are probably better uses of these resources in some other place. And so firms should get out of the market. And so what we're really talking about is an allocation of resources or capital with regard to these market signals. So that's why free market capitalism can be so useful, is because it provides us with these prices and other signals that are telling us where the best use of resources are. And so really what we're talking about is an allocation of resources and thinking about the relative rates of return on alternative investments, right? So where's the best place to put my money? Well, obviously I want to put my money and resources in places where there are profits being made. That'll give me a good return, or the best return on my investment. And so investors and other suppliers of resources are going to be responding to these market signals, looking at their highest valued opportunity. Where can they get the most value for their investment? Now, as it turns out, this pushes markets towards equilibrium. And you should note that markets are constantly adjusting. So although we do talk about equilibrium, basically the equilibrium is changing all the time. It's a dynamic thing because supply and demand conditions are constantly changing. And so in terms of the firm and the long run, when everything is variable, there are no fixed costs. It turns out that the break-even point is the market equilibrium, because that's the point where there's no incentive to enter the market and there's no incentive to leave the market, because there's neither profits nor losses. And so in the long run, the competitive equilibrium is when all firms are making zero economic profit. And that leads us to a long-run industry supply curve, which is basically the market supply curve that shows the relationship between price and quantity, just like previous supply curves, quantity supplied, after firms have been allowed time to enter or exit from an industry, of course, depending on whether or not there are profits being made or there are losses. All right, so we can basically have three different types of industries given how each firm's costs change as more firms enter or more firms exit the market. So the first we're going to look at is called a constant cost industry. And it's called this simply because as firms enter and exit, every firm in the industry's costs remain the same. They remain constant. And so another way to think about it is that total output can be increased or can be decreased, and there's no change in average long run total cost. And so what this translates into is a horizontal long run supply curve, or a long run supply curve that is perfectly elastic. All right, so this is what the graph for a constant cost industry would look like. So what we see here is, suppose we see an increase in demand, right? So here's our first equilibrium, which would be the long run equilibrium as well. Here's the long run supply curve. So the industry starts in long run equilibrium, and there's an increase in demand, right? So given the initial supply curve, the initial number of firms and the initial supply curve, in the short run, the increase in demand would cause an increase in price. Now, in the short run, what that means is that firms went from making zero profit to making positive profits. And of course, that means that new firms would want to enter the industry. And as that happens, the short run supply curve increases. And as new firms enter, since their costs of production aren't changing, we get back to the same long run equilibrium price where firms break even at P1, but at a higher quantity, right? Higher than the first equilibrium. So this is what a long run supply curve looks like in a constant cost industry. We can also have an increasing cost industry, which means that as new firms enter the industry, costs of production for everybody go up. Now, this is actually maybe easier to think about because of scarcity, right? So as more firms start producing, it makes sense that maybe costs would increase because more firms are competing for the same set amount of resources. So basically what's happening is that as new firms enter and production increases, everybody's long-run costs of production start to go up. And this is represented as a long-run industry supply curve that is upward sloping. So this is what it would look like. So we have a similar story here, right? The industry rather starts in long-run equilibrium, where all three of these curves intersect. Firms are breaking even in the long run here. There's an increase in demand, which would cause the price to go up to here actually, although it's not labeled. So price would come up to here in the short run, so firms would start making profits, and those profits would encourage new firms to enter, which would shift the short run supply curve to the right. And as new firms enter, those profits are squeezed out, and we return to a long run equilibrium where there are again zero economic profits for everybody, albeit at a higher price because costs of production have gone up, right? There's been an increase in costs of production. So this is what the long run picture and the adjustment would look like for an increasing cost industry. And then the last one, which is less common, but it can occur, is a decreasing cost industry, which is when as more firms enter the market or the industry, costs of production for everybody actually go down. And this could happen because maybe when there's more firms, the production of the resources needed in that industry are brought down because of economies of scale. So this could happen. And in this case, the long-run industry supply curve is downward sloping, which is somewhat unusual, but it can happen. And so, again, very similar picture. We start in long-run equilibrium here. Demand increases, which would bring the price up to here. And in the short run, that would create profits in that industry. And since there's profits, new firms would enter, bringing the supply curve, short-run supply curve to the right. And as new firms enter, the costs of production for everybody go down. And so as we return to long-run equilibrium where there are zero economic profits, we actually get a lower price with this increased demand and increased output. Okay, so real quick, let's look at an international example. Long-run supply curves for rare earth metals turns out not to slope upward after all, which is what was the prediction of some economists. So these rare earth minerals and metals are not readily found uniformly in the Earth's crust. And as it turns out, growing industrial applications of rare earths have caused rightward shifts of the market demand curve. So market demand has been increasing, which in the short run leads to increased prices and thus economic profits. But then, of course, these profits have brought new firms into the industry, which in turn pushes prices down to at least their original level. And so as it turns out, this rare earth metal and mineral industry turns out to be a constant cost industry with a horizontal long-run supply curve. So as we've seen, in the long run, the firm can change the scale of its plant size or the scale of its operation, since in the long run everything is variable. Everything is a variable input. It can change anything it wants in terms of its inputs in the long run. And so it will continue to change its size, its scale, until it no longer has an incentive to do so, which is the break-even point. And so, you know, it will do this until profits are maximized, but in the long run, of course, profits are zero. So, and recall basically what we've seen throughout the course of this chapter is that the firm is going to produce where price, which is also marginal revenue, equals marginal cost, and that also turns out to equal the short run minimum average cost and the long run minimum average cost. So all of these things here in this bullet point are equal in the long run. And this is what it looks like graphically. So this is the long run equilibrium picture for any given individual firm, right? So here's its long run average cost curve. Here's its short run average cost curve. It's choosing in the short run to have the size, the scale of operation that's equal, that is basically creating the minimums to all be in the same place, the minimums of these two U-shaped curves. And then this is also where the marginal cost curve crosses through those minimums. And this is also where marginal revenue is as well. So this is the long run competitive equilibrium. And so basically what we are seeing is that in a competitive industry, a perfectly competitive industry, we have something called marginal cost pricing. In other words, in long-run equilibrium, we get to a point where the price in the industry, the price that the industry is charging, is exactly equal to the marginal cost of production. And another way to think about this is that the opportunity cost is the marginal cost to society. So basically what this leads to is an efficient allocation of resources. There's no waste, and we're getting the maximum possible benefit from this type of industry. Now, anytime that doesn't happen, we don't have an efficient allocation of resources, we call that a market failure. Okay, so this is any situation where unrestricted or unrestrained market operation leads to either too few resources or too many resources going to a specific economic activity. So market failure. And we're actually going to see that firms that are not perfectly competitive, so in the following chapters we're going to see examples of market failures.